Hey everyone, my name is Erica Fletcher. I am a PhD candidate at the Institute for the Medical Humanities at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. As many of you know, I'm doing my dissertation work with the Icarus Project and with the Asheville Radical Mental Health Collective in North Carolina. Um, and I've been living in North Carolina for about a month or so, and it's been quite the experience. Folks here are really supportive of the research and just really welcoming, so I'm very grateful for that. And while I've been here, I've been attending weekly meetings with the group and other related events that I've been invited to participate in. And as of a couple days ago, I did my first interview. So I'm hoping to do quite a few more in the next several weeks, as well as start doing some interviewing and surveying of the local support coordinators across the U.S. And participate on the online forums more with a research thread. So that's kind of what's coming up. But today I wanted to talk to you all about a chapter I'm writing on the history of the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, contextualizing the Icarus Project within this larger narrative trajectory. So I want to look at the stories of four women who have participated at some level in psychiatric resistance and look at their stories within an understanding, greater understanding of the political dynamics of their time and the developments within psychiatry during that time. So I want to look through or discuss the work of Elizabeth Packard, writing in the 1800s, Judy Chamberlain and Kate Millett, who are writing in the 1970s to the 1990s, roughly, and Jax McNamara, who's writing in the 2000s and currently, as well as one of the founders of the Icarus Project. So, first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the theoretical orientation I have towards these four narratives. It's one that Deleuze and Guattari's, social theorists, talk about in terms of schizoanalysis. And schizoanalysis is this idea that you have many fragmented parts or components that are moving and clustering and contorting about. And so it's hard within that generative space to create this coherent, one-dimensional, chronological narrative about what happened, a history. And they recognize the partiality or the fragmentation of whatever stories we tell in crafting histories. And I like that perspective because it allows for a kind of open-endedness. It allows for the history that I make or talk about here not to be the only history that can ever be told about the consumer survivor ex-patient movement or the Icarus Project within that movement. Rather, it's saying, no, we all have partial understandings of what's happened, and there's many components that aren't, for whatever reason, visible or overt, and so we have to take those into account or recognize that there might be many other stories that we could tell alongside the one that we're currently telling about the work that the movement has done and the way that we place the Icarus Project within that larger movement. So that's kind of where I wanted to start because I think people have taken up the work of Elizabeth Packard, who was writing in the 1800s and used her story as a way of further legitimating their stories in the 1970s and onward. But Elizabeth Packard is an interesting character. She's a Calvinist living in Illinois, and her husband was a preacher who didn't appreciate when she would try to lead discussions with the women in her congregation about some of her religious ideas or orientation. And he said, that's not your place, that is my place. And I want you away. I want you to leave. So what he did is he brought in an alienist, what people called psychiatrists back then, disguised as a sewing machine salesman to their house, and the sewing machine salesman had a brief conversation with her and deemed her insane, that her husband was right, and carted her off to an insane asylum. So while she was in the asylum and afterwards, she had a lot of writings denouncing this practice of forced admission. And she writes in one of the passages critiquing that practice about her own experience. So she writes, "Husband, have I not a right to my opinions? Yes, you have a right to your opinions if you think right, but does not the Constitution defend the right of religious toleration for all American citizens? Yes, to all citizens it does defend this right, but you are not a citizen. While a married woman, you are a legal non-entity, without even a soul in law. In short, you are dead as to any legal existence while a married woman, and therefore have no legal protection as a married woman." Thus, I learned my first lesson in that chapter of common law, which denies to married woman a legal right to her own identity or individuality. So you can see here the forces of religion, medicine, and the law kind of um, colliding, or this collusion in which she feels like as a woman she doesn't have a right to her own identity, to her own thoughts about religion, to gather in a private space and talk with other women about some of her ideas. And if she does so, then she's pathologized, then she is deemed mentally ill. So this story is taken up by Judy Chamberlain, and Judy Chamberlain was institutionalized herself in the 1960s and really suffered a great deal from the number of psychopharmaceuticals available at the time. She was, in her words, drugged up, and she gained a lot of weight. She felt that she was infantilized at institutions, and she was only ever able to get away from that once she started tapering off the medication, and recognizing a societal pathology within the way that women have been marginalized. And in her own life, she married very young. She suffered a great deal after she had a spontaneous abortion. And didn't have many job opportunities when she was living in New York during the 1960s. So, of course, it's understandable that she might have some kind of a break, or that she might have had a period of time in her life where she was really feeling down. But Judy Chamberlain wrote this seminal article, or this book, called On Our Own in 1978, where she talks about ways to address mental states through community-based peer support methods, and really thought that the problem was the hierarchical schema of institutions, or psychiatric institutions, where there's power dynamics, power differentials between the psychiatrists and the patients themselves. So she writes, "We, psychiatric patients, are usually assumed not to know what is best for us and need supervision and control. We are often assumed to be talking in code. Only so-called experts can figure out what we really mean. A patient who refuses psychiatric drugs may have very good reasons. The risk of tardive dyskinesia, for example, or the experience of too many undesirable negative effects. But professionals often assume that we are expressing a symbolic rebellion of some sort when we try to give a straightforward explanation of what we want and what we do not want." So here she's talking about the multiple rationalities that go within a diagnosis of seemingly irrationality. So there's real reasons why people don't want to take medications. In her own experience, she found that she was lethargic, that she couldn't think coherently, and that she felt very disempowered in a way by taking these medications. But rather than talking, or when she did talk about that with other people, it was assumed that she didn't know what she was talking about. It was assumed that not taking her medication was further proof of her irrationality, rather than having some kind of rational basis for why she wouldn't want to consume those medications. So Judy Chamberlain, as I said before, takes up Elizabeth Packard's history and kind of creates this tenuous link between them and then other people who experience at some level discomfort from being in the psychiatric institutions. And she's making this link as a way of further legitimating her work as an activist in the 70s during the patient rights movement, or in health social movements in general. So Kate Millett, who's her contemporaries, kind of writing around the same time, joins the anti-psychiatry movement, which Chamberlain is arguably a part of in the 1980s and 1990s. They both work for Mind Freedom International, which is a organization that used to be a bit more dichotomous when it came towards protesting against psychiatry, and now they're catering towards more of a younger population. They're creating more nuanced perspectives on how they stand as an organization. But they both worked with this organization, and Kate Millett really vilified psychiatric institutions. She had written Sexual Politics, a feminist literary criticism book in the 1970s, and really was well known for that as a bisexual intellectual, as a feminist, as a person who recognized social or societal pathology. And her manifesto really comes out in 1990. She wrote the Looney Bin Trip as a way of kind of remembering some of her experiences going through what was labeled manic depressive, now bipolar disorder. And she never really fully took on that label for herself. She was always pretty critical of it in her own work. So in her manifesto, she says, I wrote the Looney Bin Trip to go back over the ground and discover whether I did go mad, went mad, or was driven crazy. That differentiation. But it is not so cut and dried, cannot be. And if I did go mad, even acknowledging latitude and overlap, then what was madness, the irrational? What was that like? Experientially rolling back the secret and shame, remembering. And she also writes, refuse a pill, and you will be tied down and given a hypodermic by force, in-force irrationality, with all the force of the state behind it, pharmaceutical corporations and an entrenched bureaucratic psychiatry, unassailable social beliefs general throughout the culture, and all the scientific prestige of medicine, locks, bars, buildings, cops, a massive system. So here you can kind of see some of the way that she's writing as this like stream of consciousness monologue, this really driven kind of intent to critique the way that she was treated. And she was quite successful in lobbying or litigating the state of Minnesota to try to change laws. She also had a great number of friends who were lawyers and activist protesters who paradoxically, some of them turned her into an asylum and other people got her out. So she had quite a bit of clout, and she was pretty well known as a person who really protested forced admissions into asylums. And here we can see the kind of parallels between Elizabeth Packard's experience and Kate Millett's experience, even though they're writing 100 years or so apart. So lastly, I want to turn to Jax McNamara. And Jax is one of the founders of the Icarus Project, as many of you guys know. And she really has a great sociological imagination, what C. Wright Mills talks about as contextualizing personal troubles within a larger historic and cultural context. And she, unlike Kate Millett and even Judy Chamberlain, I think, takes a more nuanced view towards biomedical interventions or psychopharmaceutical interventions towards medicating or mediating mental states. And along with De Brule, they really wanted to find this third space where they could talk about some of the struggles that they felt were inherent within taking medication, some of the normalizing aspects of living in a heteropatriarchy, capitalist society, but also saying, well, for themselves, they might at times want that medication. They might want to have a little bit more of a flattened affect or just to control some of their states. And so from the anti-psychiatrist perspective, they were kind of seen as being a pushback, as a way of marketing almost pharmaceuticals, and that was not their intent at all, but they kind of received flack from both ends, from people who were pro-psychiatry saying, no, you're really devaluing our field, our profession, our epistemology, and from other folks saying, well, you're not doing enough, you're really just being the poster child for bipolar medication. But anyway, Jax talks about some of her work in an interview and places herself within a homophobic society. She writes, I would say for me, the intersection of oppression around gender and sex and around my sexual choices deeply impacted my mental health because of all the harassment and the homophobia and the bullshit. I had a ton of shame. I internalized a lot of things. I had been told by my family that I was ugly because I looked like a man, that nobody would ever love me. I mean, these were things that were said outright. I think that a lot of queer people, even if the level of homophobia and harassment they deal with isn't as overt, still internalize a lot of messages that it's not safe for us to be in this world, that the love we have isn't real, that we are ugly or different or unlovable. That hugely affects our mental health, hugely affects our ability to feel like we belong to the human race, and whether we have any idea how to grow up and live lives that we actually want to live. Um, and Jax McNamara also really incorporates art into her work, and the Icarus Project does as well, as saying that art or music or other kinds of ways of expressing oneself is a way to talk about mental distress or extreme mental states without necessarily pathologizing it. And in McNamara's artist statement, she writes, my art is an attempt to find visual language for the paradox of wonder and tension in a fragmented world. Often the pieces articulate an outline of contested and persistent space, what we carve out from what we are given, what manages to resist the encroaching darkness of modern life. The works become improvised diagrams for the connections between the incidents of grace and loss that mark a life lived between hope, despair, and constant contradictions, punctuated intermittently with the open expanse of sky and the resilience of growing things. And what I really like about Jack's work is her open-endedness that her writings and the Icarus Project as a whole allow. They allow a space, like a third space between pro-psychiatry or anti-psychiatry perspectives to come together and have a discussion about one's own personal experiences, one lives experiences without necessarily being prescriptive. And even though there's publications out saying, well, here's a harm reduction guide to getting off of psychopharmaceutical drugs if you're interested, it doesn't mean that right now is the right time to do that, or even that it's always something that everyone should do if they're happy with how they're interacting or engaging with medications that they're taking. And so I think there's more freedom within this space. There's something that's different from what we've seen historically about the ways that people have resisted psychiatry in the past. It's a way of being with medicine at times, or stepping back from it, but not defining oneself through the medical gaze, through the medical lens solely. And I think in reading these unruly texts and reading these resistance narratives, we can think of them as productive spaces, as ways to counter the progress narrative of medicine, particularly that of psychiatry, saying that we're always on the up and upwards, that we're reaching new heights, and we just need this latest scientific discovery, this latest new drug to get us to a state that we want to be, whether it's happiness or sharper attention span, greater attention span. That's not necessarily the aim that we should look towards, or even the things that science can actually promise and fulfill. These texts also highlight our increasing interpolation within biomedical frameworks. So there's an idea within this progression of writers and thinkers that increasingly, as people living in the United States, as consumers, we can all be interpolated through the medical gaze. We might all be at risk for some kind of mental illness, for some kind of mental distress, and that the proper response should be to consume, to take ownership of one's illness and seek out medical advice. This kind of glorified belief in the medical system without being pretty critical, or at least somewhat critical, of the way that one's own body interacts with the medication. It also reveals a criminalization and a scientization of social problems. So, in focusing on individual habits and individual identities towards sexuality, towards religious beliefs, towards motherhood, we can see that at times it's been more of the social problems, or what is seen as social problems, that are equated with pathology at the individual level, rather than looking more broadly at the environmental stressors that exacerbate whatever kind of mental states people have exhibited. Furthermore, these texts reflect a kind of mania and depression as in our society as a whole. This kind of drive towards success, however success is defined traditionally for women, and that has been through motherhood or fertility, or from contributing to society in those fairly narrow ways. Um, and I think that in thinking more about these narratives, we can really build a space for what does it mean to think about the culture of medicine, to think about the projection or the potential projection of societal norms and desires onto patients. And in that, we can form a better understanding for the liminal space between madness and sanity, and the productive space where personal experiences really illuminate the historic marginalizations of people, be they women, immigrants, LGBTQ communities, indigenous groups, people of color, people with disabilities, etc. And I think the Icarus Project within that space can help imagine alternative worlds, create a more poetic openness, like the kind of work that Jax does, to grapple with alternative attitudes, languages, customs, and orientations towards mental distress. So, in thinking about how this chapter fits in to the larger work, I'm interested in the way that folks from the Icarus Project consider themselves within that history. And I recognize that even putting them in conversation with some of these writers and thinkers is not necessarily how the group itself formed. There's a lot of just doing with Jackson Sasha, like forming this group, forming this online forum, and then after the fact, reading more about the history of the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, how they fit into this larger narrative. And so it's retroactive in the way that they might themselves place their history. Sasha just wrote this really awesome piece that's published in the Journal of Medical Humanities on how the Icarus Project, from his experience, or from what he sees as being the primary connections within the group, has drawn from a number of different cultures, including anarchism, anti-psychiatry, permaculture, sustainable ecology, the LGBTQ movement, harm reduction movement, global justice movement, counterculture, and punk rock. So these are all ways that he draws or makes sense of how different forces have coalesced to create what the Icarus Project is today. And still, I think that it's important to kind of situate their work, or the work of the group, within this larger consumer survivor ex-patient movement, even though they didn't necessarily know what it was when they started. Because I think it points to a larger critique of biomedical epistemology's one size fits all kind of model. And that's something that I really want to explore in the future. So I'd love to hear your thoughts or comments on this chapter. What I've given you is really a summary of some of the things I've been thinking about and working through. Message me, email me if you want to read the whole work as is. I still haven't heard comments back yet from my professors at UTMB, so I'm sure it will change with some of their comments and with some of your comments as well. So anyway, thank you for listening. Take care.